Our second keynote speaker, I'd like to welcome Dr. Ruakere Hond. For over 30 years, Ruakere has worked on Māori language immersion programs and community projects creating Māori speaker communities and revitalising regional language in Taranaki. His views have helped influence New Zealand's language revitalisation strategy. This keynote address will try to encourage participants to understand the practical implications of the 2016 Māori Language Act and understand the focus being given to community-based activity. Mr. Ruakere Hond.
Rangi tua ki rua, te roro tuia ki roto, tuia ki wako, reri haupai mārani. He honore nui tia mātou ki te whakarungo ki a koe e kore mai ana. Kia ora, tēnā mātou. Tēnei te mihi, tēnā koe, tēnei te mihi ki a koutou. Nau mai piki mai, ko te tumana ko ka whai hua, tēnei hui huinga o tātou. Nō reira, he rangatira, mana wa nui koe. Nō reira, pai kiti i a koe. Just before I just want to say that we were just welcoming Mātua, who's a doctor, on stage and just giving him a whakatau. I suppose one of the challenges I'd like to put out is that we have a wonderful gift here in New Zealand and a wonderful taonga, and that's te reo Māori and tikanga Māori and te ao Māori. And I suppose the challenge is for us as leaders to take the word to upgrade our knowledge and our understandings, and I think that schools need to invest more resources, and it shouldn't be an add-on, but it should come out of your operational grant, and it would be a wonderful gift. This man is a man of mana, and he knows that I'm going through a journey in terms of my reo. I'm not even a new entrant, but I'd just like to encourage us all, we go down that pathway, start thinking about it as we think about Māori achievement, as we think about the Tiriti o Waitangi, and what bicultural and what being in New Zealand and some of the things that can separate us from the whole world. So kia ora mātua.
Pua wai au no runga I te tikanga he raurenga no roto I te raukura, ko taku raukura he manawa nui ki te ao, he manawa nui ki te ao. E me ia tuana ki a koutou, whai whakaaro ana hoa whanaunga, piringa karanga maha ki tēnei te whakarau ora I tō tātou reo. E ngā ringa, e ngā wāwai o ngā kura o te motu, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It's not my role to welcome you here to Taranaki. As I understand, you are welcomed appropriately this morning, and previously as well. My role is really to give a background around where reo Māori has come from in the recent past and potentially where it heads in the future. So connecting with Māori language revitalisation, koera taku kaupapa kōrero. With the introduction, for me, 30 years, it sounds like a long time I've been involved in this game, and it was more than 30 years ago when I was in a laboratory at Waikato University doing biochemistry as a master's, moved into a master's, and my lecturer, Dr. Peter Molan, came along and said to us as new students in our master's program, here are your research topics, rotten bananas and bull sperm. And because we were looking at the enzymes that turn bananas brown and how to increase the longevity of bull sperm. I looked at my mate who was in there and I said, maybe it was my naivety, I said, I didn't really sign up to this. The next day, I was already starting to pack up my car. I left much to the concern of my mother, who was looking forward to me passing and moving into the life of science. And I came back to Taranaki and became a teacher in a koanga reo locally. If I had stayed another year, if it was the year later, potentially I would have carried on, because it was looking at the enzymes that are in manuka honey, and the antibiotic activity of those enzymes would have been, I believe, a lot more exciting for me. However, it headed me down this pathway. I moved into more Māori language. 1985, this was 1985. 1985 was a critical year for us in Taranaki. It was the year that Te Reo Taranaki started as an organisation that is still very strong within this region in terms of raising the profile and encouraging the use of our regional dialect, our regional language variation, that is Taranaki reo. It's also the year that Te Reo Taranaki gave a submission to the Waitangi Tribunal on the Māori language claim, which was really my introduction. The very next year, I signed up to Div C at Auckland College of Education to become a teacher with Tuki Nepe. That was the very first class that was done all in Māori, Div C training, and I did science and maths and Māori language. Again, my naivety got in the way of that a little bit. I thought that coming back to Taranaki, I would get a job teaching maths and science, but in Māori. That was my focus. 1986, that wasn't really on the cards. I applied for a number of schools. They wanted science and maths teachers. Not many Māori teachers were needed at that time. So again, much to the concern of my mother, I decided to not take up any of the offers that were given to me, and also not take up the offers to be a public health officer. And I went on the dole and I started researching Taranaki reo. That's how I became involved in this kaupapa. I started to teach reo using ātarangi, a method where you use Cuisenaire rods, and I'm still very much involved in that now. My kōrero that I want to give today is very quickly, where has reo come from since those times? And then where is it heading into the future, so that you can understand where education fits potentially in the future of where reo should be moving ahead. This is your prep. Hopefully you've been reading it and not listening to me. Fishman is like the godfather of language revitalisation. This was one of his last writings before he passed away. And most of the theory that we have around language revitalisation was derived from his writings and another person, Bernard Spolsky. I don't know if you've come across him. He is now the main leader in language revitalisation, but he began his path of language revitalisation. He came to New Zealand as a refugee from, he's Jewish, and settled with his mother here in New Zealand, became a teacher of English and history, and realised that in Gisborne Boys High School, that was his first post, that the students that knew how to speak Māori were some of his best students in English. And it was a direct contradiction to what he was taught in his teacher training, that by having another language to begin with, what conflicted with the ability to be able to comprehend another language. So he started to ask the questions about why having Māori to begin with had an impact on their ability to utilise and use and create English language in a way that was of a higher standard to the other classmates. He then went over to America, did research with Navajo, and then now he's at in Israel. I've forgotten which university he's with. Anyway, Joshua Fishman. This is what he's saying. What I'd like you to focus on is, first one, is languages don't die. So you don't immediately forget a language. If you have a language, you tend to have that language for life. You have a capacity within that language, particularly if you've learnt it by listening and speaking. You tend to have that language. The way in which languages are lost is there is a generation where people decide not to speak that language to the next generation. And by failing to speak that language to the next generation, in one generation, that language ceases to be available to those communities. So it takes one generation to lose a language. So you don't lose a language among speakers, you lose a language among communities within the culture. And the way in which it's done is the language becomes disconnected from the culture of those communities. The communities work out a new way to relate to their culture, and that is within English. In New Zealand, that's how it's done. But it takes 3 generations, according to Fishman, 3 generations to restore that back into a position of where you've lost. So we've got a long way to go in terms of 3 generations. I'm going to start with something, sea change. I like this concept. You're probably wondering what it means. It means that. There has been a sea change of recent years for Māori language revitalisation. And I like the word sea change because of this. If we go to, in The Tempest, this is where the word sea change was first used. And I love that first statement. Full fathom 5, thy father lies. Only Shakespeare could say to Prince Ferdinand, your father drowned at sea, in that way. But the main point that I'd like to make is that in that second to last statement, a sea change into something rich and strange. That language revitalisation is in this process of changing in something that can be rich and strange to some people, but the nature of it being strange opens up opportunities to reconsider where we're heading with it. Kei te pai? Okay. Sea change isn't like God descending from the sky, and she's actually a Eastern Orthodox church follower. It's not really like, if the focus a lot, it's not like Taranaki, 1 year, go the Barrett brothers, Hurricanes, and then there's a change in franchise, and then suddenly we're under the Chiefs. So go the other Canes, Sam Cane, and it's not like that. The sea change that I'd also like to focus on is not like this, where it's a change in social norms around anti-smacking and the like, where we change attitudes and there is a shift in what people see as being normal or acceptable. The sea change that I'd like to focus is more like this one, where the evidence starts to build up. We have a large body of knowledge that starts to build up, and we start to ask the questions, well, why isn't this working the way that we want it to work? That we expect that by just giving out information, people's behavior will start to change. And so around anti-smoking, people's behavior doesn't automatically just change because all the information is out there. Quite often it takes a lot more to prod and change people's attitudes by changing policy. That's really what's taking place in terms of language revitalisation. I'd like to start, where's the evidence? Some of you will have heard of a person by the name, worked with NZCER, as I understand is still working there or is advising there, Richard Benton. Have you heard of Richard Benton? So he did the largest sociolinguistic study of reo Māori around the country, 33,338 people, individuals, 6,470 families were interviewed. And from that, they started to map out what was taking place with reo Māori around the country. And this took place between 1973 through to 1979. Ruakere, Tūhoe, Te Kao, and Whakatane are 3 of the locations or the identifiers. If we look at these, the dates down the bottom are the dates that people were born. So this paper came out in 1991. So people that were born in 1970 were 21 years old. And the people that were born in 1900 were 91 years old. What this really does is it is able to identify when people were exposed to reo Māori in communities of speakers. So if they were speakers of Māori, pretty well across the board, people didn't learn to speak Māori in schools in 1900, right through into 1970. Learning Māori was very much an academic process. So these speakers that are identified 100% up there at the end gained their language from hearing it in the home and in their communities. So from this, we're able to gauge when people were a certain age that reo Māori was still being used in communities. As you can see, the yellow line at the top is Ruakere, and Ruakere was probably, under these measurements, was the last community in the country that was still using Māori in 1970, in maybe 5 years beforehand, because 1970 would make maybe 5 years old, they start being able to have enough language to continue on into later life. Does that make sense? Okay, let's go to the next one, which is looking at Ngāti Kahu, Te Aupōuri and Te Rarawa, way up north. Ngāti Porou, surely be really good. Ngā Puhi as a whole, and Ngāti Kahu Ngunu. This is what the figures look like. This is a medium group of communities where the drop-off of language is post-World War II. So World War II, we see a distinct drop-off of language use in communities. And there's a large number of communities in that grouping. This is a sample of them. And then if we look at the next block of communities, Tauranga, Rotorua, Taranaki, Wanganui, Manawatu, this is what the figures look like. So this is a group of communities in iwi where the drop-off of Māori language took place after the World War I. So there were different stages at which Māori stopped being spoken from those communities. Kei te pai? Okay. Then, I look at these figures, which is the urbanisation. The ski slope is the green is Māori living in rural communities, isolated rural communities, most of them. And we definitely see in the post-World War II, the vast majority of Māori families are moving out of the rural environment and into an urban environment. Kei te pai? And then, this gets a little bit confusing, maybe. I pull all of those figures together of those around the country of what is happening with those different groups, and then we take a rough average of those. That's what that curve looks like, and then we superimpose on that the rural Māori population, and it's very well aligned. So for a long period of time, within our Māori communities, the focus was around the government, what the government did in terms of the loss of language from our communities. I'm not saying that the urban shift was the only factor, but it was one of the major factors in the loss of language from our communities and our whānau. Right? So now I'm going to take a look at, these things here. When I use the word language revitalisation, it's a little bit different to common language concept of revitalisation. Revitalisation in common language means to give energy, restore vitality. In socio-linguistic terms, it can be traced back to this guy Stewart, who talked about vitality as a measure under his typology of endangered languages, where communities are able to retain their language even though another dominant language is taking place around them. So they're not isolated. If communities are isolated and it's only them speaking to themselves all of the time, it's very easy for them to maintain their language. But language vitality is the concept of a community to be able to sustain itself while it's unisolated, while it's in that dominant language. Some examples around the world are the Basque communities. They do it extremely well in some areas of their communities. And Catalan, they operate very close identity-focused communities, and they operate and they maintain these very strong norms of language use. And then if we go to Spolsky, this is Spolsky's term. When he tried to summarize language revitalisation, because language revitalisation is restoring those type of communities, in spite of the fact that there is Englishes everywhere, that how do we maintain communities where Māori language is also normalised? and that is this concept of intergenerational language transmission. That's what that is. So parents speaking that language, that target language, to their children. I'm going to go through quickly now in terms of a historical overview. The petition was really the beginning of a consciousness raising throughout Māori that Richard Benton's research then added a higher level of understanding that in a short period of time, by the year 2000, according to Richard Benton, there would be no native speakers left in this country. Part of that, the background to that came out of the petition was also Māori Language Day, that the year later became Māori Language Week, of a promotional week. And the petition said this: "We, the undersigned, do humbly pray that courses in Māori language and aspects of Māori culture be offered in all those schools with large Māori roles, and that these same courses be offered as a gift to the Pākehā from the Māori in all other New Zealand schools as a positive effort to promote a more meaningful concept of integration." That was the language of the time in 1972. And in 1972, the focus was definitely government took our language off us through punishment. So the George Grey's Ordinance, where schools couldn't get funding unless they taught only in English, and other forms of punishments such as speaking Māori and within the school grounds was punished. That's the impression that most Māori communities had about what the government did to ensure that Māori language wouldn't be retained. And so, quite obviously, the focus should be that the government now needs to be held responsible for restoring our language for us. And so, what better place to do it than schools? Schools, education, we've got a lack of language capacity or proficiency. Schools teach language, adds up, ne? This is the 1985 was when the hearings were, where Te Reo Taranaki was first began, and in 86 the claim came back with these 5 areas. You notice very prominently an inquiry into how Māori children are being educated and how accessible are reo lessons. Again, education was a large part of the solution that was sought by Māori communities around where our reo should be. Broadcasting is another one. And then that became part of the Māori Language Act of 87, and these were the 3 things that were focused on. So the Māori Language Commission is now Te Taura Whiri Te Reo Māori, which has changed slightly with the new legislation. In 1997, with a range of challenges that were made on government, in particular in broadcasting, they said that the government should take an active role in ensuring the future, the stabilisation, the restoration, the protection of Māori language. And so in 1997, the government then started to institute specific strategies around what should be done for the future of reo Māori. The first one was in 1999, and the focus around that was about creating more opportunities, but also more people learning to read and write and speak Māori, and for resources to be made available and to modernise Māori language so that it is fit for our current world, our current life worldview. In 2003 was really the first time that true language planning processes were used. And again, it followed along the lines of that we need to raise proficiency and we need to raise the number of speakers in this country. So more emphasis went in on language education. The health of Māori language then started to really become more focused in on language planning approaches. And then in 2011, the Ministerial Independent Review Panel on the Māori language sector said that of all of this money being spent in Māori language is still not being spoken in our communities. It's still not being spoken in the homes. In the review that they did over the year, it showed that of some estimate $500 million, and 83% of that was in education. of all of that amount of expenditure, language revitalisation was still not being achieved. They made a number of recommendations, such as a minister of Māori language. Didn't go down too well in the government of the time, but it also focused in on how do we encourage more reo being used in communities and in the home. From that then came a Māori language advisory group that then started to build the sea change that I started my kōrero with. The sea change is around refocusing where the attention should be for the future of reo Māori, which then became part, and some of you would have seen this, that came over the news last year, the passing of the new Māori Language Act. The Māori Language Act, to summarise, this is taken from another presentation, is described as being a two-sided house, a wharenui, and you have one side, which is the Maihi Māori, which is seen to be the haukainga, or the tangata whenua side, which is Māori communities, families, iwi, and the like, who are focused in on using reo in their daily lives. And then on the other side of the house is across the population, the wider population, throughout the country, where the focus should be on raising critical awareness, improving, strengthening positive attitudes towards reo Māori, and the status of reo Māori. Right? So in actual fact, what it is two strategies rather than one strategy. And these two strategies are based on these concepts. So if we look at, Steve Mahari's gone, so the sociology focus of this is really if we look at these two different perspectives of society. So on one side we have things such as freedom of choice and uncertainty, and on the other side the concept of security of a shared vision. And they are quite different perspectives of how we structure our relationships in our daily lives. Generally, these are described as the concept of community, and while the word community is used generally across the board now of any group of people that come together and interact, such as communities of learning, communities of practice, in a concept of where community originally came from was the concept that people were engaged actively together on a regular basis and shared in each other's and shared their directions and their vision of the future. This is really where language revitalisation then becomes focused around these two strategies, and that can be shown now. So the difference between a locally distinctive language, which is a language which is in the area where your school or your activity language community is based, and a standardised official language that may be presented through curriculum and over national networks and the like. The idea that language is acquired intergenerationally in the home, and the other one where language is acquired formally in school. So for a long time the focus has been around the concept of society and the role of government, a top-down approach through policy determining on what is the future of reo Māori. In terms of community, when we look at the figures, as I said, in 2011, where some say $250 million and others say $500 million, where around about 83% of that funding went into education, 3.8 of that budget went to community-focused activity. The new strategy with the structure around Te Maihi Māori and Te Maihi Korona then allows iwi and local communities then to start identifying what are their goals, what are they seeking to achieve, and in terms of building capacity within their communities. In terms of communities and families, if families are speaking with each other on a regular basis, it's only natural that the regional language variation, the dialects and the like, then become normalized within that area. If we're looking at across the country and the standardized official language that is shared across the country through the schools, through the curriculum, then people have an understanding across the country through government documents, through broadcasting and the like, of that form of language. The focus for schools and the attention that's given to education is included in the community area, although it's an area of tension. So the way in which this side of the strategy, the Māori strategy side of language revitalisation, is that there are 7 regions from the top, from Taitokero, right up north, all the way through to the south. Here in Taranaki, in this area where we are now, it goes from the top of Taranaki all the way through to Wellington, 21 iwi in this area. That's one of the regions of those 7. And included on top of those 7 are 4 that are language stakeholder groups. So one of the language stakeholder groups is urban Māori. So urban Māori organisations, there is a special role or a representation of them within that group. There's broadcasting and the role of broadcasting through television, radio, and other online types of activities. The other one is community, so national community organisations and organisations around the country that are focused, that aren't specifically focused in on iwi and local communities. And then the last one is education. The representative for education is Mereana Selby. Some of you have heard of her. She's the CEO of Te Wānanga o Raukawa. So a grouping of the Māori stakeholders in education came together and selected her to represent education in the area of language revitalisation. The focus that I think where we're heading in the sea change I spoke about is that we need a planned approach to the future of reo Māori. That if we only focus in on what the state's role is for the future of reo Māori, then we will end up with reo Māori as being very similar to an academic subject such as French that is taught in this country, even Latin, a language that isn't used anymore but is hauled out of the cupboard when it's needed in official capacity, rather than something where children grow up with reo Māori as part of their worldview. It's a part of the normalised part of their upbringing. The intergenerational language transmission means that the gains that are made by one generation aren't lost to the next generation. So that we don't get a situation where parents then they learnt Māori in school and they went along. Myself, I went along to school to learn Māori. I went to Hatopetara College on the North Shore. My parents sent me off to school, did 5 years of learning Māori. Great, learnt Ngā Puhi Reo. Lang Davis, top Māori language teacher there, and I could write oodles in Māori, but to speak I could hardly say anything because most of the focus was on grammar and most of the assessments were all in writing. The focus away from that and each generation of parents saying, I'll wait until my child is 5 years old and then I will send them to school and the school will solve the loss of language for my family. Those days are really gone. We have to change our approach, we have to change our understanding so that communities start to take a greater role of the future of their reo, and their reo is more likely going to be localised reo and localised leadership and focused in on oral capacity rather than a national focus of official language, which is mainly writing and reading. I'd like to finish. I'm not sure how much I've got to go in terms of this. I know that I've probably got a lot more than this. However, tomorrow I'd like to run a workshop around language planning. So the concept of language planning in its broader sense is well developed. So after the Second World War, we had language status was a key area in the United Nations around development. Language status was focused in particular in the beginning, was about the importance of raising the focus on English language around the world, and that English language was the tool for in particular developing countries, to have access to the wealth of the world. And so status then became more of a focus then. What is the attention that is given, legislated attention that is given to the local languages as well? And so New Zealand followed that in 1987 with the Reo Māori becoming an official language. Becoming an official language doesn't solve our problems. However, it does open an opportunity to understand really what language status is about. The other areas of language planning are in the area of corpus. So corpus is the concept of a body of language. And in Māori, it's things like dictionaries, waiata, karakia, and that body of language, grammar, is all part of the resources that assure the future of the future generations have access to language. We've made great progress in that area across the country. The other area is language acquisition. So language acquisition obviously is focused particularly in formal education. However, in the new environment, there are two new areas of language planning that have been added, and that is language critical awareness, so understanding what it takes for language to be revitalised, and the other one is language use, creating domains of language use. For schools, I think the focus should be around how do schools connect with the activities that are taking place in their communities. How do children, with the language they're learning in the school environment, how does it connect with what is taking place in the community, so we don't get a situation like myself spending years teaching people to speak Māori and doing a great job that I think is. So at the end of the year, they're speaking beautiful Māori, we give them the certificate, we say goodbye, and they head out the door, and the next year we get a new set of students and we build another community and we send them out into what is effectively a desert. There is nowhere really for them to use their reo. And so a year or two down the track, people are asking the question, when you bump into them in the street and speak Māori to them, they're shrinking away because they've lost all confidence to be able to use that language. So the focus for Māori communities is about creating domains and spaces where reo can be used. And if that can be linked up to what you're doing with students, and students start to have access to it, then they will be able to then maintain those connections well beyond school and well beyond simply finding employment and advancing their academic careers. Koe rā taku kōrero I te rānei. As I understand, we've still got a little bit of time, but whether there's any questions? Hei te pai.
I have two questions actually. One was, in the UK I think there's a sort of projection that a lot of local dialect will be lost in quite a short period of time.
Yes.
That's sort of becoming increasingly seen as inevitable. Do you think that's true here? Do you think the focus should be on keeping the language as a whole rather than smaller dialects? And the second one was on when you put the charts over each other.
Yes.
You had the loss in language came before the urbanisation.
Yes.
That was interesting. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that.
So that it's about a 10-year, although it's not accurate because it was only a sample, and some of the percentages. This is it here. Some of the percentages are larger numbers of people as opposed to such as Te Kao. There's quite a large spike, and that's largely because of a small sample size. Whereas larger iwi like Kahungunu have a much larger, so it's not really it's not exact. However, we could surmise that one is that there is the same level of slope, and there is a gap of around about 8 to 10 years between the two, and that could indicate that it takes around retaining language being spoken around a child up until they're 8 or 10 years old for them to be able to retain it confidently later in life. So that could be one of the learnings from this. However, it's not, I can't say for sure. There is evidence to say that up until a certain age, some say 5 years old, and some say 8 years old, that if they have language proficiency up until that age, then they are more likely to be able to use it later in life. I did a course with a kuia in Taranaki, and she was very whakamā, couldn't say anything really in Māori, but had spoken Māori up until she was 5, and then was taken out of that environment and then spoke only English. After 3 weeks, it was like a switch being flicked, and immediately she started speaking Māori again, and she was completely blown away by the fact that that language, she didn't know where it came from. And that was because there was in the subconscious of our minds, because our language exists in our subconscious, which is the difficulty about learning language in a classroom. We learn language in our conscious mind, we remember stuff, but language, as I'm speaking to you now, I'm not thinking of a single word I'm saying. It's coming out of somewhere. It's coming out of this, as Chomsky talks about a language acquisition device. In the back of our subconscious, this language is being processed, and to do that, you need to be in an immersion environment. So that kuia, after she was, I think, about 70, and after 65 years of not using their language, that switch was flicked. And I see it with a lot of students that have learnt Māori for 2 years, and they have a high level of proficiency, and they come really shy, and they've forgotten everything, and they say, I can't remember anything, I need to start from absolute scratch again. You can pretty well bet after about 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, that language all starts coming back. It's about being in an environment where the language is normalized, and then our brains, our subconscious takes over. Is that all right?
I want to say about that time period when the Maori language dropped off.
Yes.
First generation New Zealander.
Yes.
There was a big immigration at that time from a lot of people from Europe, and my father was hit and told not to speak his language as well.
Yes.
So there might have been a cultural view at that time that English, because of the immigration coming through
Yep.
the country, that English was the spoken language of the day. So
Yep.
it wasn't just Maori.
Yes.
He got an ID too.
That was in particular in the post World War II period, where that concept of development was focused in on having capacity in English. English was the language of the world, and so that loss of the role of education perhaps changed attitudes and perhaps encouraged people to move away from rural environments and into urban environments. That helped make that shift. But once people were in an urban environment, generally, and a lot of our kaumātua say once they were there, they had the view that they were in another world now. They wanted their children only to speak English, and that's what's going to get them a job, and that's what's going to allow them to survive into the future. So, but the mechanism of language lost was the losing of those communities where language was normalised. Children pick up language so quickly at a young age, and that if they're in those environments where reo has been spoken, they're picking it up subconsciously. When they get into an urban environment, however, the likelihood is they're not going to be exposed to Māori being spoken, and it's going to build on English.
Kia ora. I just wondered if there's any incentives to train more Te Reo Māori teachers. In parts of New Zealand, they're very difficult to come by.
Yep. If you look at the Waitangi Tribunal report that came out, I've forgotten the number of it, around intellectual property, and within that report, because a large part of it was around language, they said that one of the biggest failings around language development post the Māori Language Act in 87 was it was identified very early on that we would need a large pool of Māori language teachers to be able to meet the needs that were being identified under the Māori Language Act. However, teacher training didn't head down that path. So the numbers of people that were being trained in Māori language to be able to teach in Māori medium and to teach Māori language just never eventuated it with sufficient numbers. Trying to get people into those roles and to be trained is a very difficult task. Sometimes the best students to be Māori language teachers in Māori medium are the students that come from those Māori medium classes. However, many of them they want to move out and see another world. They've been in this world of Māori medium, and the idea of going straight back into that as a teacher sometimes is a very difficult thing to comprehend. However, Māori language training of Māori language teachers is a huge priority. What is the policy and the resourcing that's put in behind that, I'm not sure. Some of the real pressures that are on Māori language teachers, in particular around the other workload that they have, and you've probably heard all of those arguments. However, the other pressures that are on teachers to leave the teaching profession, because there are a lot of other jobs that are available that sometimes are a lot greater opportunities in other areas. There is a pressure, in particular some of the interventions of taking teachers that don't have high language proficiency and to train them up in an immersion year. Many of those participants in that training quite often leave at the end of the year and they go off and do other things. And that's partly a reflection that the Māori language development is growing significantly well beyond education, in particular around broadcasting, and government agencies in particular are now being required to have more and more Māori staff with language proficiencies, and Māori teachers are great to fill those positions. That's a sad reality. So there needs to be more done in that area.
But I was also going to say that it's everyone's ownership too.
Yes.
Why aren't we cross-pollinating like we cross-pollinate across our mainstream schools in terms of the curriculum?
Absolutely.
Why don't we cross-pollinate across the Māori?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
As well.
Yep.
So, I'm not proficient, but I'll try so that I become culturally responsible.
Yep.
Don't we have to consider that as well?
Yep.
Or is it their job? Is their Māori?
Yeah, no, well, communities are not one specific people. Communities are communities and made up with whoever wants to be a part of that community. In my experience, if people are really committed and have a positive attitude to what's taking place, their inclusion within that community activity is welcomed. The real focus is how do schools engage with those community level activities, so that when a teacher goes off to, I don't know, Wānanga Aotearoa or another course and starts to build their language proficiency, what capacity is there to allow them to participate in community activities and community initiatives, so that they then have a connection to be able to start to engage in other people that then can be resource people that get called in to support what's taking place in the school environment. It's a bit difficult at the moment because some of our communities aren't well resourced, and so we're asking a lot of people that don't have resourcing, and schools in those areas, and there isn't a lot of resourcing as well. However, I think there's a way forward. We need to take small steps at the moment. The Māori Language Act has only been last year. It began last year, and the Māori language strategy under the Maihi Māori, the Māori ownership is only starting to roll out. There's $10 million that's been made available for the whole country in this area of starting to get some initiatives underway, of local communities taking leadership. We need to make sure that schools understand that. I'm really looking for big things from Meriana Selby. I'm hoping that your organisation can have a discussion. I'd like for part of your organisation to sit down with Meriana and say, where does this area of Māori language revitalisation fit and how can we work alongside it? Kapai. I think that's my time. Ka mihi nei kia koutou, kua rongo, I nei kōrero. Tomorrow I've got a planning session. I'd like to focus in on what sorts of activities are going to be prioritised rather than some things are going to have a bigger impact in communities as opposed to other things, and to talk and to tease those out and to filter out what could be potentially helpful in the future. Nō reira, ka waiho atu I reira te kōrero, ka mihi nui ki a koutou, ngā tūmoa ki tuarua, E ngana nei, kua mōhio ko te tumuaki, ko ia te kanohi a kite ana. Engari te tumuaki tuarua, kei au koutou te mahi nui ki roto i te kura. Sometimes we think of deputy principals as like a deputy chair that's waiting in the wing for the chairperson to need help and then suddenly gets called on. It's not like that at all. I understand that quite often the principal is the one that is seen out there and is the face of the school, and yet the work of what takes place in the organisation within the school comes down to deputy principals. I see that very similar to our Māori. Sometimes our highly proficient top speakers are the ones who are seen, and everyone sees that that's where our reo is at, and that's where we've got to aim, when in actual fact there are huge numbers of people that are working on a day-to-day basis that are largely unrecognised and yet are so vital for the future of reo Māori. Tēnā koutou.